In this section, we're going to walk through examples of what's happening in supply chains in larger organisations and the opportunities that are available, therefore, for you to get ahead of the game with your net zero strategy and with your sustainability. Chances to really tie into that phrase that's at the top left of your screen, sustainable growth. How do you grow your business sustainably and how do you make the most of the opportunity that you're sat at the bottom of? There's a few examples we're going to walk through here. The first one is the NHS, which I think has got a really good example and a real good history here in terms of the timeline of approach they've taken that gives us an indication of the scale of change that might be starting to happen. If we look back to 2022 and April, they had announced a social value weighting of 10% to all of their contracts and all of their suppliers. So looking at their supply chain, they started to understand that actually they can incorporate their net zero standards into that to reward businesses that might be slightly ahead of the game. In 2023, they started making this a requirement for any contract that was worth £5 million or more in terms that needed a carbon reduction plan that aligned with PPN 0621, which is some government documentation which will come on shortly to explain and define in a bit more detail. And again, don't worry, it sounds technical, it's much easier than you think. April 2024, they started announcing this year that all requirements, so regardless of size of tender, everyone needed a carbon reduction plan or a net zero commitment in order to engage with the NHS. If we look forward into the future, 2027, we're starting to see much more ambitious targets around reporting on scopes. So we can see here all three scopes are needed. Life cycle analysis of individual products. So if you're supplying pens into the NHS, what's the carbon footprint of that individual pen? And that's not going to be until 2028. And we start to see restrictions and changes coming in beyond that. So there is this timeline that is publicly available from the NHS in terms of their procurement guidelines that gives us the idea of where net zero is sitting as a commercial opportunity. Another example for this, which is a really good one, I think, is Microsoft. And again, they've got good public documentation around how they're using their supply chain and their procurement documentation in order to drive decarbonisation. They're slightly more ambitious than other organisations and they are requiring a 55% reduction by 2030, and that is comparing it to a 2019 baseline. So again, 55% might sound quite scary, but it's likely you'll have already reduced some of your emissions since 2019, even if it's in things like hybrid working or in upgrading light bulbs to LEDs. The reason why they choose that 2019 baseline is then it gives them a comparative year against a lot of their suppliers, but also it's a year before COVID happened, where it's the last kind of realistic year there is. The important thing here is, though, every year, if you are a supplier to Microsoft, you are required to submit plans on how you are reducing your impact, and they will monitor that progress. They're also looking at carbon pricing mechanisms, where if you are a high carbon but low cost organisation, you might actually have a project carbon price applied to your project so that it brings it in line with the lower carbon but potentially higher price projects. Ideally there, that will then drive the desire that if your organisation is a lower carbon one, you are more likely to be picked because you're going to be more price competitive than potentially a high carbon organisation. This all sounds quite technical and scary, but what does it really look like? Well, if you look at the journey towards 2030, and again, keeping in mind that 55% reduction against the 2019 baseline year, which you can see is the orange column here, it's likely that in 2020, your footprint as an organisation, if you were operating in 2019, will have quite dramatically reduced. Lack of travel, lack of commuting emissions, lack of business travel, probably a reduction in waste and various other things will have meant that there's been quite a dramatic drop there, and then it's probably rebuilt itself over the next few years as we go back up towards 2023, where you're then operating a bit more, all steam ahead. It's likely that due to increases in wind and solar power on the grid, as well as again maybe electric vehicles or just changes in behaviour, your emissions might start reducing in 2024 unless you've significantly grown the organisation. What we see here then is a year-on-year reduction that is a slow sort of glide down towards that 55% reduction by 2030, and that's equivalent to around 11% a year. So with 11% a year in terms of your carbon reductions, you will be able to meet Microsoft requirements and you'll be able to submit those plans and be able to compete. So hopefully that makes it feel a little bit more manageable than having these really big figures being thrown around. To look at PPN 0621 again, this is a documentation, and these are the technical requirements it includes. So you need to just demonstrate your scopes 1 and 2. And then in terms of scope 3, it's looking at things like business travel, waste, transport that you're producing or moving things around, any commuting that you're doing, and energy, which is part of your scope 2 as well. So it really is a very simple snapshot of your business that can be quite easy to get this data. The main thing with the requirement for PPN 0621 is it also requires a plan of action. So essentially it would be 1, your baseline year, 2, your most recent year in terms of your carbon footprints, so measuring in 2019 as well as 23. Then it will have reduction targets. So when are you aiming to achieve net zero by? Is it 2030? Is it 2045? What reduction projects are you undertaking? Are you installing LEDs? Do you have electric vehicles? Are you installing maybe solar on site, etc.? And that's it really. So once you've told that story and gone through and formatted it quite technically, that is your document to go forward with. So again, we're seeing that transparency and that storytelling being really important here, and that's something we're here to help with. One last example would be someone like Tesco's, and I think I wanted to use them because they are under the Science Based Targets Initiative claims, and therefore they have got that 50% reduction target themselves. And I wanted to give a quick demonstration of what the supply chain looks like, because it might be that even if it's not you, it might be someone else that you know that is going to be impacted by this. So for example, Tesco's might look at their carbon footprint and realise that a bread supplier is their largest spend, is their biggest supplier each year, and therefore they're going to engage them first as their biggest supplier to go, well, your carbon footprint is probably our biggest footprint in terms of our scope 3 emissions, and therefore we want to engage you. That bread supplier will then turn around and do the same process and go, well, actually we're moving millions of loaves of bread a year. That's going to be mostly on diesel vans and lorries, and therefore our logistics provider is going to be the main thing. That logistics provider might then start looking into their own accounts and looking at their own carbon footprint, because they've been requested to by the bread supplier, who's been requested to by Tesco's, and they then go, well, to get that data, we're actually going to need to engage our team, and therefore we need to bring in the HR department to try and help with this, and we need their carbon footprint as well. They're then probably going to turn around and go, well, actually we're buying loads of paper every year because of how we're operating, and therefore is that recycled paper, is that FSC certified paper, what's the footprint there? That paper supplier might then turn around and go, well, actually, this company is supplying us with certain widgets for the machinery, and therefore they want your carbon footprint as well. And this is how it's starting to really knock on. It's very fragmented, it's quite difficult to predict, but it is cascading down to smaller companies who are perhaps not expecting to be hit by this. And we are really seeing that supply chains are the main way that this pressure is coming. It's not necessarily coming through things like legislation, because small businesses tend to be kind of omitted from that legislation at this stage. That might change in the future. The benefit is that your emissions are someone else's emissions as well, and therefore we're trying to really fill in that chain, and that's why it's called the supply chain, right? It is a chain of links that we're trying to tie up, and therefore the more that you can provide that data to other organisations, the more willing they are going to be to work with you, because you are making their problem go away. To give an idea of that and why Tesco's might be following that pursuit of engaging their supply chain around food producers is, well, if you look at their carbon footprint, around 90% of their emissions is coming in from the products that customers are buying and then consuming or throwing away. And therefore it's a huge sort of wedge of their emissions they need to tackle. And the more that they can engage people who are supplying Tesco's, the more that Tesco's footprint is going to decrease as well over time and help them meet their targets. Interestingly on this, and this is all publicly available information, if you go onto the Tesco's website, they do have sustainability information. I'd recommend you take a look. 1.4% of their emissions in 2022 to 23 was in running their stores. So, 98.5% of their emissions came from other parts of the business. And so this is why, going back to that first video where we looked at the 5 key areas of your business, it's really important to keep that in mind. Things that you're moving around, things that you're buying, things that you're selling is all going to be a big part of your footprint that you might not be thinking about if you're thinking this as purely an energy-based one. This is applying to Tesco's. It's also applying to a lot of other organisations. I'm using these as examples because they've got the most publicly available information. But please do, go and look at your customers or your suppliers and understand their footprint, because that's where a lot of this is going to come into. So just to summarise this section, really things are happening behind the scenes that you might not be aware of. We're going to be seeing a lot more of this pressure coming down the line, but it is going to be coming from indirect sources, and it might be coming from unexpected areas as well. So the more that you can get ahead of that, the more you're going to be in preparation. And the key thing here is that taking action on these items and reducing your footprint down is going to help you prepare operationally and commercially for the future. Final section, we're going to look at some of the actions that you can take around benefits they will have on your business, as well as the carbon reduction impacts they will have.